Final Fantasy VII is a multi-game saga, and the reason FF7 Remake is a multi-game saga is because it is an absolutely massive game. A game that is being expanded right now with the Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy. And it's becoming huge, right? Like, Rebirth is several times the size of the original FF7, in part because they are, for one, making it one-to-one scale. They're adding a ton of content to Re-Trilogy, making it even bigger. Many would argue better. Some people would not argue better, but at least from a gameplay perspective, I would argue better. And according to YoshiP, they might have the same idea sort of with Final Fantasy IX, because in a recent interview, YoshiP has said that Final Fantasy IX Remake might not be possible as a single title. This is kind of worrying to me, because when I've always thought about FF9 Remake since the leaks, I've been thinking about Final Fantasy IX Remake as one complete game that was a lot more true to the original FF9 in terms of gameplay and style and combat with a fresh coat of paint, right? That's what I've been thinking about when it comes to FF9 Remake. So now knowing that there is a possibility out there that FF9 Remake could be going the Final Fantasy VII Remake route, I'm sure excites a lot of people, but also makes a lot of people kind of nervous, because again, while I think the Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy is widely loved, I also think that FF7 Re-Trilogy, a lot of the criticism that it gets comes from its multi-part direction. Even a lot of the story stuff, a lot of the criticisms there also comes from the multi-part direction too, because they had to expand things in order to fill up 3 games. But let's go ahead and take a look at the article here. In an interview with Video Games, the website, I mean, your Xbox hasn't gained sentience yet, Yoshida says he's aware there are requests for Final Fantasy IX to be remade. But when you think about Final Fantasy IX, it's a game with a huge volume. Similar to its PS1 siblings, Final Fantasy IX's polygonal world was stretched across multiple kingdoms, caves, marshes, wintry peaks, and unusual places that now seem to route by Final Fantasy standards. When you think about all of that volume, I wonder if it's possible to remake that as a single title, Yoshida says, probably alluding to the same problem Final Fantasy VII had with its trilogy of expensive remakes. It's a difficult one. It is a tough question. The article then says, all that volume could be connected by a flat, barely detailed landmass old school JRPGs called the world map. But giving Final Fantasy IX the remake treatment would probably mean those locations would need to be stitched together more realistically, thus inflating an already huge game. Again, keep in mind, he's saying this while presumably Final Fantasy IX Remake is already in development. Now, as the article does mention here, old school world maps used to have a relatively flat, not necessarily detailed by today's standards, world map. The world map would have random battles and things on it, but one of the things that made making games of those scale a lot easier was having that world map, because you did not have to make one-for-one scale of all of the regions and all the different areas of the game. By the standard of modern fidelity, by the standard of modern graphics, having that super deformed style, having the large character walking across the small map, at least according to Square Enix, at least according to the AAA lens through which they view these games, is considered no longer acceptable. And I think this is the reason that a lot of people preach about stylized graphics, and of course FF9, in particular, FF9 had stylized graphics too, but a lot of this has to be given up for the sake of realism, for the sake of AAA fidelity, for the expectations of what a modern video game is. And in a weird way, those expectations of supposed high quality is kind of like what's holding them back in the first place, right? The more detailed these video games become, the less abstraction becomes acceptable, right? The less the idea that things don't have to be as detailed becomes, is just creating a huge problem. I really do appreciate Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy. I think that Remake and Rebirth are probably the finest single-player Final Fantasy games that we've gotten since Final Fantasy X, at the very least. Maybe even more, because I do think that Rebirth in particular hit like such an insane high level of quality. However, I mean, the biggest problem I have with selling these as separate games, even beyond the price point, the dev time. You're having one team dedicate, between these two games, probably a decade of their life. I'm assuming 2 games. It could be more, right? I would hope that it would at least be 2 games if they are leaning into multi-part. But you're having them spend a decade or more on remaking titles. That makes me feel kind of dead inside. Just hearing about it. It makes me feel dead inside because I'm like, yeah, Dell, you put it right. What a waste of life. These very talented developers having to spend a decade of their lives remaking someone else's work so you can have this really brief experience of reliving the 90s and early 2000s. That's the current reality of game dev though, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not like 100% anti-remake. However, I also see the trade-off, the opportunity cost that comes with choosing to make a remake over a new work. Because there is a loss there that is incurred whenever you do a remake over a new work. A lot of the best games I've played in the past 5 years have been remakes, right? 7R trilogy, Resident Evil, all the Resident Evil remakes really. Persona 3 Reload, huge. I love Persona 3. Remakes are good. I do wonder if our pursuit of remakes, our obsession with remakes, and the opportunity cost that we incur with remakes a lot of times is necessarily worth it, right? The popularity of remakes from the perspective of the corporate side is that you have a very low risk product that has a much higher chance of having a great ROI with lower risk. And the reason we have that obsession, or they have that obsession, because remember, this is the corporate POV. The reason corporations are looking at that and wanting that is because AAA is so out of hand. The better move to make is to remake something so that we can be safe, so that there is a better chance of having a return on investment that is substantial with low risk. That's what we're looking at when we talk about all of these remakes and such, right? I think the big conversation around FF9 in general is that stylized graphics does not mean graphics are bad. But understand too, one of the hurdles that FF9 had when it released was that FF9 was kind of looked at like in an undesirable way because it did have more stylized graphics compared to something like Final Fantasy VIII. And people were looking for more of Final Fantasy like 7 and 8, like what they were pushing in terms of stylization, which is actually kind of funny too, because you look at FF7 and the imagination, like your imagination as the player was really doing the heavy lifting there. Because practically speaking, FF9 is actually more realistic, quote unquote, looking than say Final Fantasy VII. But it's like, it's very much like, oh, this is how it looks. This is how it looks in my head. This is the way I perceive it. I also think that whenever you look at the artwork for Cloud, or you look at the artwork for Zidane, and you compare those two, I can understand how the artwork for Cloud alone would be more appealing to a younger edgelord audience than, say, the artwork for Zidane and Co. Stylized graphics doesn't speed up development in the way people think. In some ways, it makes development take time longer. I would explain if someone cared about the rant. Actually, I'd love for you to go on a rant about that. I think that would actually make a good that would make a good Twitter thread, but I also feel like some stylized graphic stands would freak out. I think that the immediate thing that jumps out to me is that with stylized graphics, you actually do spend a tremendous amount of time actually figuring out the art style, and that's something that people don't even think about, right? Whereas at least with realism, we already kind of have the target in mind for what we're trying to hit kind of intuitively. Whereas with stylized graphics, there is a lot of playing around with the textures, the materials, the way the eyes are going to look and the mouths are going to look, and all this other stuff, and the visual effects, and how to actually achieve that stylized look. Okay, let's compare Spider-Verse to Kingsglaive, right? Spider-Verse would not take less time than Kingsglaive, for example, with realistic CG graphics, right? But it is true to say, as Leon Belmont puts it here, stylize making the game accessible to all consoles. Right, because you can come up with an art style that will allow things to be low polygon enough to run on the Switch, to run on weaker systems, I should say, to run on systems that don't have the same specifications as, say, a PS5 Pro or a high-end PC. Okay, so Dell says, I met an artist on the outsource team for KH3 that are based in Hyderabad, India. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. They explain that character works takes extremely long time as the sheer amount of iteration and redoing you have to do. Like you mentioned, you have to play with everything a lot for it to work. You can't just look at a real eye or a real photo of a jacket and imitate. So now you have two problems: iteration time, a nebulous goal. You need to find artists who are capable of emulating that style, which is hard. That's actually a lot to think about. Yeah, when you add all that together, it's really hard to say that stylized graphics are necessarily saving more time. Way easier to find artists that can make realistic stuff, right? Because when you say stylized art, each artist has their own style, right? Every artist is making their own thing. But I'll tell you what, every artist at some point has to study realism. So it is indeed true that stylized art does not necessarily save time. And with that being the case, I already think that Final Fantasy has a consistent art style that really works well for it. I think the hybrid realism anime art style that they currently have going on is already a banger. He's already iconic in the same way that Soejima's designs are for Persona, in the same way that Akira Toriyama's designs are for Dragon Ball and Dragon Quest and those sorts of things. I think the anime realism hybrid that they currently have should be the style that they stick with going forward, because that's a really cool style. That's a style that's, you know, kind of timeless and can evolve, and you can show anyone that stuff and they think it looks cool, right? Like, you know, even like some of the dated CG scenes in like, you know, like say FF10 that are 2 decades old, you still look at and like the visual style for the characters is still awesome, you know, even though it's like semi-realistic or whatever, you know. I don't think the move is necessarily to shift you back to stylized graphics. I mean, for Final Fantasy IX Remake, of course, you know, you do expect those stylized graphics. The pursuit of fidelity is the real issue, like Skyline is saying. It's not necessarily that you're pursuing stylized graphics versus realism. It's about, we're pursuing realistic graphics and you're going to be able to see, you know, the stitch lines in a jacket in ultra 4K, that we're going to be able to see the eyelashes on the character and that it's going to be that detailed and all this other stuff, and then we're going to render things to that level. We're going to do all these different physics simulations and of cloth and like all this other stuff, and nothing can ever clip. So it's not necessarily the case that stylized equals cheaper, but it is the case that is really expensive. Now here's where the other side of that nuance comes in, right? Fidelity, like realism requires more fidelity. So is kind of the way that realism ironically ends up kind of taking the same amount of time or more time than stylized graphics, even though it has all the hurdles that we just mentioned. But because you have to put all that fidelity into realism, I guess it does end up kind of evening out, or maybe making realism take more time or cost more money and all these other sorts of things. And so average character model on PS2 took 2 weeks. Now our character model is 3 weeks just for the hair. Could you imagine like where we would be in terms of like video games in general if character models were taking 2 weeks like they took on PS2? Could you imagine where society would be? That would be incredible, right? And now, like Dale says, we're spending 3 weeks just making hair. Why does YoshiP keep talking about FF9 if he's not in charge of it? I have no idea. We assume that YoshiP is not in charge of it. Maybe he is. I'm under the impression that YoshiP is not in charge. CPU3 is not in charge of FF9. They might be, because he did say that CPU3 is working on a couple of stuff. He did say that CPU3 is working on a couple of games, right? And we know that one of them is Final Fantasy Tactics Remastered, and we know that one of them is Fantasian. I assume that someone else is handling Final Fantasy 9, but maybe he is, because he gets interviewed more often. I mean, YoshiP gets interviewed more often than anyone at Square Enix for sure. You're definitely right about that, which is cool. That's what we like about YoshiP in particular, is that YoshiP is out there. He's transparent. He's honest about these things. He communicates, where a lot of this stuff is very opaque. He's also extremely honest about, you know, what goes on with developing games. Sometimes he's too honest and he reveals too much and he gets himself in trouble, but we really appreciate it nonetheless. I really appreciate it, because there's not too many people, especially, you know, with Japanese game dev, where a lot of this stuff does tend to be opaque and you can't really, you know about like the real reasons behind certain things, or like what budgets are like, or how much time things will take. And YoshiP will just come out and just explicitly say all of it, you know, to really explain why certain decisions were made. And yeah, it sucks that like more Japanese devs can't just be transparent about what's happening because of the corporate structure there and kind of the culture. But YoshiP doesn't care. He'll say whatever's on his mind, and I think he's really based for that. He's a really cool guy. If F9 Remake was happening, YoshiP wouldn't be saying anything about it. Actually, I think it's the opposite. If FF9 Remake was happening, he would just be saying, like, I don't comment on rumors and speculation. I think, well, no, actually, you're right. I don't know. Actually. Maybe you are right. I feel like FF9 Remake has just leaked so much that no one even cares anymore. It's just like a talked about thing. I'm gonna be blunt, not gonna buy a multi-part FF9. So many great games come out that stand alone. I don't have time to wait 15 years to finish a remake. FF7R is the first and last time I'll do it. I think that FF7R was a very valuable and interesting experiment in the idea of a multi-game remake. And I think that when you look at the sales performance of Rebirth and where we expect the sales performance for the next game to be, I think it's made it very clear that multi-game remakes probably should not be a thing going forward. I think that has been kind of clear here. I don't think that the multi-game remake is the way to go moving forward. Part of it is just that when people play the first game, you have to get people to finish the first game to even be interested in the second part, right, of the next remake game. And so, you know, for however many people bought Final Fantasy VII Remake, which we know is around 7 million now, of those 7 million people, how many of those people finished, like actually finished Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1? Whenever you look at like the data on people finishing video games, it is actually pretty depressing compared to the number of people who buy them. People buy a lot of video games, but people finish a very small number of video games. I'm projecting right now, I really am, because I buy so many video games. I don't know about you guys, but like my library is thick. How many of those games I like actually get around to like seeing the credits of? Not nearly as many as I buy. Don't get me wrong, I play a ton of games because I'm always moving on to the next thing. We all do that, I think. No, we definitely all do. Like, I think that most people do that. Otherwise, you know, I wouldn't be self-reporting. You know, I'm self-reporting, but I also think that everyone else can really hop in on that and say that, yeah, I too have not finished nearly as many games as I've bought. I also think that's fine, by the way. You don't have to finish everything in your backlog. I think you only really need to finish like the stuff that like keeps you interested long enough to finish, right? Like, so yeah, you know. We got a super chat here from Giant Monkey Butt. Thank you so much. There's also the FF9 remake that's supposed to come out. Couldn't the remake share the same art style of the anime and release together? Where's the anime at? That is a great question, Giant Monkey Butt. I think, to answer your question, I think that is what's happening, right? Like, I think that is what the plan is. That the FF9 anime and the FF9 remake are going to launch simultaneously, and they are going to be prepared to launch next to each other, and one is not going to launch without the other. So I also think that if the game is having any issues, they're going to delay the anime. If the anime is having any issues or is behind schedule, they're going to delay the game. That might suck for some of you. Some of you may not like that. However, if I were to put it this way, the amount of sales it's going to increase to have it there simultaneously is huge, right? How many of you went and played Cyberpunk because you saw Cyberpunk Edge Runners? I went and played Cyberpunk because I watched Edge Runners, right? A lot of people did. Yeah, a lot of people in chat saying me. Now imagine if Cyberpunk the game was like 6 months after Edge Runners came out. You probably would have maybe you put it on the back burner. If you really liked Edge Runners, yeah, you would have went and picked it up. But for a lot of people, they kind of would have just, it would have slipped their mind. So it's really important that if they're going to do the anime and game approach, they need to have the anime available when the game is able to be purchased. I don't think that they should ship the FF9 anime if the game is not there to go and purchase. Because I think that if the FF9 anime turns out to be good, and you get like 5 or 10 episodes into the anime, and you're like, oh my god, I love this. You mean to tell me there's a game? You guys, The Witcher 3 saw an explosion of sales as a result of The Witcher live action, which unfortunately has gone to absolute crap past the first season. First season was amazing, and then it went terrible, but it saw staggering sales. I think they said they sold more copies of The Witcher 3 after the live action came out than they had sold at all up to that point. The Last of Us saw a very similar boost after the HBO series dropped, which is why they wanted to have The Last of Us Part 1 out of the PS3 version of the game, because they were like, oh my god, this thing is going to sell like crazy if we line the things up. The Fallout games, dude, recently with the Fallout games, games. The Fallout games got a massive boost in sales thanks to the success of the Fallout series on Amazon Prime, which if you haven't seen, please go watch it. It is so good. Imagine if there was a Castlevania game that you could have went and bought when the Castlevania anime came out. Imagine, dude. Stinky Duck, thank you so much for this super chat. What do you think about these comments from YoshiP? Do you think Creative Studio 3 carrying this title, and if it doesn't share the battle system of 16, could there be another battle system entirely for FF9? Oh, do I think Creative Studio 3 is carrying this title? Okay. Again, thank you for the super chat, Stinky Duck. I think considering the number of times that YoshiP has talked about FF9, and I also think too, when you consider the number of references to FF9 in Dawn Trail specifically, I do think that there is a strong chance that somewhere in Creative Studio 3, they are the ones working on Final Fantasy IX Remake. That being said, when it comes to battle mechanics, I absolutely do not believe Final Fantasy 16's battle mechanics are being used for FF9. I think if that's a concern of yours, or I think if that's something you might be excited for, in either case, I do not think that is going to be something that happens. I do think that they are probably going to stick to turn-based. According to a lot of the rumors that we've seen, they seem to say that it's turn-based, so that's actually very good. He said himself he wouldn't make FF9 an action game. Also, that's true. I forgot about that. YoshiP himself had a quote out there where he said that he would not make FF9 an action game. I believe him. A lot of people were actually concerned and worried, which is why he commented that on in the first place, because he was like, no guys, if I was remaking FF9, I would not make it an action game. So I don't think you have to worry about FF9 being turned into Final Fantasy 16. I don't think YoshiP would do that. I think YoshiP is willing to try a lot of new things when it comes to making a brand new original title, but I think just judging from the way he works on Final Fantasy 14, that YoshiP has a lot of respect for the older Final Fantasy titles, and because of that respect that YoshiP has, I don't think he would try to turn FF9 into an action game. I think he would be like, that's a bit too much. That makes me very optimistic. That's good. It is time for Square Enix to return to the animation and film industry. However, I do not think it is time for Square Enix to do it internally. I don't think it's time to put out another Kingsglaive or another Advent Children. What I think it's time to do is to get a quality anime studio or a quality film studio and get them to make quality animation and quality film, because that's what those teams do. You wouldn't get a film team to make games, and you shouldn't get a game team to make films. Hot take, I know. Josh Z, thank you so much for the super chat. I have played 9 more than any other FF game. I agree with YoshiP. There are so many castles and big architecture locations, you can't fit all of them in a single game. There is a lot of content in 9, you're not wrong. It's huge. The only way I can consider making FF9 all possible within one game. Turn-based is a lot cheaper to make than action, and it is a lot faster to make than action combat systems, unless I'm missing something. If Dell is still in the chat, he can fact check me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's sound reasoning to say. So they would be saving a lot of budget and time when it comes to at least keeping the game turn-based. Subtext, thank you for the super chat. It sounds a whole lot like you're ready for the return of FF7 The Last Order. NSP is a Last Order fan confirmed. Here's the thing. I do think the creators need to be involved with it, right? So I do think you do need like Anomina overseeing it, but I don't think he should necessarily be directing it or writing it necessarily. And I'm using him as an arbitrary example there. I'm not saying him specifically, but I do think that you need people who know what they're doing in terms of creating something specifically for film or animation, right? It's one of the reasons that Studio Trigger was able to do such a great job with Cyberpunk Edge Runners, right? That being said, I do not want Final Fantasy IX Remake to be a multi-game saga. I do think that that is one thing with this game that could dampen my excitement for it if it does end up being a multi-game. I think that we've seen a lot of varying success with it for 7 Re-Trilogy. I think that these multi-game remakes just take way too long. A lot better to have these developers, working on different games rather than spending, a decade of their life just remaking one title, right? Because while I do think that remakes have a good place, I don't know if doing remakes on that scale is necessarily the place to do it. And honestly, if it's going to take that long to just remake Final Fantasy IX, then I really think perhaps we should be looking at just making brand new Final Fantasy games instead. That's my take on that.